go with DVG Part 3.
Ooh.
There we go. Very fancy.
DVG 3, I like that.
DVG 3.
Oh, that's cool.
As we were doing the past 2 weeks, we'll break down our main characters here. Saul, got Goliath, of course, and the Philistines. We're going to move Goliath one spot over this week. Put it there. Then, old David, here at the end. So for part 3 of our story, David versus Goliath in the book of 1 Samuel, let's go to Esther, chapter 4. And you say, we're never getting out of this study. You're right. Back to the book of Esther. Esther, chapter 4. What does a book written hundreds of years later have to do with David versus Goliath and all the things we've talked about? Let's find out. Derek, can you read for me?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do verses 10 through 14, please.
Okay.
Of Esther chapter 4.
All right. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this.
All right. Thank you very much. So here in Esther, we have Esther's challenge of having to go before the king, and if the king didn't want to see her at that moment, becoming the former queen really fast. And Mordecai, who I think Samuel would have very much gotten along with. They're just very much the same nature kind of people. Mordecai lays it out pretty bluntly and says, you can do this, you cannot do this, but deliverance is going to come. God's going to work. Things are going to happen. You can be part of it or not. And who even knows if this is the whole reason you're in the position you're in. Hundreds of years later, but a perfect summary and illustration of what we've been talking about and what we'll see tonight. When deliverance and rescue and proof of God's working should have come from this spot, but with disobedience and fear and everything else, it didn't. God raised someone else up, just like Mordecai promised Esther would happen. And deliverance comes to Israel through another king and through someone else to fulfill God's word. So let's go back to 1 Samuel 17. With that in mind, and then with things we've seen the previous couple of weeks, where we've left off with Saul is reluctance. Even when he had the Spirit of God on him and God's full blessings, just never really buying into it as much as it seemed that he should have with God's blessings on him. He's got obvious anxieties that have overcome him. He's also got numerous triumphs. In spite of his weaknesses and failures, God has used him greatly to start consolidating the kingdom of Israel together, to give them rescue from some of their enemies that are pressing all around them. And they're getting some of the things the people of Israel had looked for. But by the time we come into this chapter, we've also got a rejected king. So God and Samuel had presented it in very stark terms. Obey God, follow him, things will be well with you. Reject God, reject his word, and you'll be swept away, you and your king. And Saul is the leader of that and the example of that. And God has, at this point, swept him away from ruling and his family from ruling in the future. He's on the throne, but it just might as well be as good as done. When you know the whole time that if Saul had taken a repentant attitude and had kind of dealt with the situation as it was, God still would have worked with him. Because even after his first disobedience, he has these many great victories. But he just couldn't bring himself to that point. So he's rejected. He's done as king. He's also going just a little bit nuts at times. Got some crazy episodes where this evil spirit troubles him and he's just out of his mind, and a guy named David has to come in and play the harp and be the musician with the Spirit of God on him that brings Saul out of it. So you've got Goliath and you've got the Philistines who are very confident, also very history-minded, as we saw throughout the whole book of 1 Samuel. When they come up against the Israelites, or when they're dealing with their own problems induced by taking on the Israelites, they're always quick to point out the history of it. Well, their God did these things in Egypt, and these things happened. Like, they know the history. So they're coming to this battle with the history in mind. With a confident, they're history-minded. They've issued a challenge. To take on their champion. You come to Eliab, David's oldest brother. We don't know much about him. But what we do know is that he's rejected from being Israel's next king due to some heart issues. Some things aren't quite right in his heart. Looks as good as Saul, as tall as Saul, as beautiful as Saul was, but not God's choice. And then here, we do have God's choice for the next king. He's got the Spirit of God on him. You know, he's also a handsome, good-looking guy. Very red, apparently. Kind of reddish guy. He's been known already.
He has beautiful eyes.
He has beautiful eyes.
How do you know? Because it says. It says.
He's a man of valor.
Richard Gere played him in the movie.
Richard Gere played him in the movie. Oh, boy. That's a whole thing. And he's already been in Saul's court at this point. He's been Saul's armor bearer. So you'll get, and listening to some stuff for this, you'll get a whole lot of debates over whether or not that little section of chapter 16 happens even after this. I don't think so. I think it lines up the way it lines up. It makes the most sense to me. And we'll kind of see that a little bit as we go. But there's some reasons people think that the playing the harp and being the armor bearer and all this stuff happened later. But narratively, it seems to make sense to me the way it is. All right, so we come back to chapter 17. And we've got a whole lot of people in a whole lot of different places here. As we've looked at, the Philistines have gathered themselves to battle in this valley of Elah with the Israelites. They're on both sides of this valley, so they've each got mountain positions. They're well set where they're at. There's this valley in between them. Goliath comes out as the champion. In verse 4 of chapter 17, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath. Goes through all his credentials, nearly 10 feet tall, armor about 125 pounds, carrying a spear with a tip that's about 15 pounds. Big guy, impressive guy, and as we saw the first week, possibly, I think I spelled that wrong. Possibly, maybe that's wrong, I don't know. Possibly one of the sons of Anak, or descendants of Anak. The same kind of giants that terrified the Jews when they were supposed to be getting into the promised land. So they go to the promised land, they see all these problems with these super tall giants, sons of Anak. Eventually, Joshua and Caleb get to the promised land, they clean house, and drive these giants to only a couple places, one of them being Gath. So as before, it was a whole bunch of giants that terrified them, now it's one. But their giant problem is back and it's right in front of them. Verse 8. And Goliath stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If you be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. So for Goliath and the Philistines at this point, I'm going to put the general category of obstacles as we talk about the main story tonight. Obstacles that come up along the way. And notice immediately what Goliath does here. When he comes out, he sets the terms of the fight, not only in the specific challenge. So we'll go one-on-one. If I win, you serve us. If you win, we serve you. But he also presents the two camps in very specific ways. When he comes out, he calls himself a Philistine. So with all the history that entails, all the war making that they've done, all the success they've had against Israel in the past, the power that they've wielded, these 5 cities they've got that are spread out and powerful, and he calls them what? What's he refer to?
Servants of Saul.
Servants of Saul. I'm not a Philistine. I am one of the Philistines. I'm with this whole huge group of people, and you're all servants of one guy that's not even in his right mind some of the time right now. And you have to wonder, again, so much speculation on my part, but I don't know, I like throwing out speculation. You have to wonder if the Philistines know exactly when to attack. Like obviously, politics never changing throughout the thousands of years of Earth history. That word has gotten out not only in Israel about Saul's position, being rejected, having fights with Samuel, not talking to Samuel, but word has no doubt gotten out to these guys here. And they get just close enough to capitalize on everything that's happening, but they still send out somebody to fight for them because they've had as many or more losses than Israel's had at this point in battle, right? And they've gotten their tails kicked a lot of times too. So for them, it's also very advantageous to send out one guy and have him fight. It's like, maybe things are bad with Israel right now. Their God's powerful. We know that. We very painfully know that. But maybe we can take advantage of it right now. But still, we'll send out this one guy and let him fight. So you've got the Philistines being nervous, and Israel, with everything happening with Saul in the background, but you've got Israel being nervous by this giant showing up. In verse 10, and the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
It's in 1 Samuel.
Yeah, 1 Samuel 17. Yep. So let's make this point about obstacles here. I don't want to use that word. Use this word. Israel is in its army. It's got all its people together. And they are in war-making mode. Later on, when David finally shows up to the story, it even describes how they go up to the front lines and they make their war chants and everything else until Goliath shows up. But when do they get scared? When Goliath says, send somebody out. Send one of you out. And no one wants to be that one. No one wants to be that one guy. And it's the nature of obstacles that they are. They're just harder to face alone. With anything that we learn about in church, it can be the same way. It's like, we know what God says. We know what he teaches, what's in his word. We're reminded of that. When we come here, we learn more. We learn and we grow. But then it's Tuesday, it's 2:15, and the other bill comes in. You're dealing with a jerk at work, or the doctor's about to call in 10 minutes, and you're by yourself. It's a lot harder. That's just the way it is. Obstacles are tougher to face alone. And David's going to show a little bit of the way to do that in his story when he comes into the picture here. But for now, Israel acts like a lot of people would, and they're greatly afraid at what's happening here and what's about to go down. Verse 12. Now David, so coming back into the picture after being anointed king in chapter 16 and working with Saul for a little bit. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. So Jesse's already pretty far up there. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest. And the 3 eldest followed Saul. So repeating a lot of what we've seen in the previous chapter about David and his family and all that. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Get all sorts of theories what that means. I think you just take it at face value. Like he was in the court and he was not in the court sometimes, and he went back and forth.
He was the armor bearer.
Yeah,
So.
he was the armor bearer.
Yeah.
So he may have been in the battle for a little bit. Also, kings of Israel could have had many armor bearers. It's possible. Later on, Joab, David's ambitious right-hand guy, it's reported that he has 10 armor bearers. So there's all sorts of armor bearers around. So David was probably free to roam about the country here a little bit. But he's back in Bethlehem. And the Philistine in verse 16 drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. So he just keeps saying all this stuff. Obstacles are hard to face alone. All obstacles are also noisy and a nuisance. Sometimes they just don't go away, and they come back. Sometimes they come back for 40 days in a row. They make their voices heard. They make their shouts, and they make their proclamations. But before we go any further with David, one other thing about obstacles. They also lie. And what's the lie in Goliath's case here? What's the lie that we've seen already? And David's going to point it out real fast when he shows up.
Well, they're not servants of Saul, they're servants of God.
Yeah, that's it. Goliath came out and announced himself as big, mighty Philistine, and he pronounced them to be servants of this guy. And they bought it, and they didn't think about it any further. Said, yeah, we are servants of Saul, and yeah, we should be a little freaked out right now. But when obstacles come in our lives, there's always some kind of lie involved. Whether it's ones we tell ourselves, it's one other people can tell us sometimes. But there's always some kind of lie we have to deal with. David's going to see a very specific one that he has to deal with here in a little bit. There's all sorts of lies that come along, whether it's we're not good enough, or God's been there every time except for this one time specifically, or this is too much, and there's no way. There's always a lie involved, because we know that Satan is a liar.
It's like it's in his name.
It's like it's in his name, yeah. He's a liar and the father of it, the Bible calls him. So when obstacles come our way, challenges, especially spiritual ones, there's some sort of lie involved, because that's what he does. That's who he is. And Goliath is just repeating that. But for right now, they've bought into it. So obstacles can talk, and obstacles can lie. But Israel's convinced. So Jesse gives David something to do while this is happening. Verse 17. And Jesse said unto David his son, take now for thy brethren an ephah of his parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So Scripture's being pretty generous here, right? There's not a whole lot of fighting really going on. It's more like staring off with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. So this is the spot where the armies line up against each other. They're making all their noise, rattling all their sabers. And then as soon as Goliath comes back out, the Israelites are back in their tents. They leave. So they're all sorts of it's like they've learned nothing for the past 40 days. They still make the show, but then Goliath shows up and they leave. They're gone. And David left his carriage, in verse 22, in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brother. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. Okay, so same pattern, repeating itself out all the way again here. Only this time, somebody different heard the message that's coming up here. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king, will enrich him with great riches, and will give him a daughter, and will make his father's house, give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And you can see here how they bought into the lie just a little bit, how different their wording is going to be from David's wording. So when they announce it, it's, have you seen this guy that's come up to make fun of us? That's come up to make fun of Israel. They've kept it again related to themselves and their country, and that's it. This guy is making fun of us. This guy is mocking us. It's all about us. But Saul, on the other hand, for all these things that he's been going through, is completely shut down, but willing to make some promises. So he throws out that whoever defeats Goliath, whoever kills him, can have great riches, will be married off to the king's daughter, and his father's house will be free from taxes. So yeah, they're just throwing the ladies around again. That's part of the part of the package. This happens a lot in this deal. And also, by the way, is a total lie. It doesn't happen for David later. And then it gets into be a whole mess after that. But this initial promise never even kept anyway. Verse 26, and David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done, and the man that killeth this Philistine taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David will throw in his camp here. Backs up what's already been said about him as being a man after God's own heart, because he's focused on the true picture. And when he comes up against this obstacle, in this case, he looks behind the lie and sees the truth about what's really going on. The most prominent thing here being, this Philistine. Reminder, by the way, that these guys aren't God's people. This uncircumcised Philistine. So take away the street cred the Philistines have. These guys are outside of the circle of God and outside of God's blessing here at the moment. That he should defy the armies of the living God. And that changes the whole thing up from just defying Israel, right? So defy Israel, defy Saul. Israel defied Saul already by this point. Like Israel's told him, you can't do certain things. They've already slapped him around a little bit. So Israel gets defied all the time. But who is this person coming up and defying God? Who's taking him on here? Verse 27, and the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. So the one thing that the other troops can do for sure is repeat all the great things that Saul said.
They got that memorized.
They got that memorized. You can almost see them like working themselves up about it each night. It's like, oh yeah, this is just a great thing. Let's do it. And then, we're not going to do this. Verse 28. So Eliab comes back into the picture. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And in one verse, we get an idea. Jerk. He's kind of a jerk. Yeah, he's a pretty big jerk about what God was getting at. And when I read this verse, this is what came to mind. It would have been the same situation all over again. like good looking, tall, strapping young fellow like Saul, but he has these fears and these insecurities in his heart. Also keeping in mind that even if he doesn't know what it's for, he knows that he's been rejected. Like he stood before the prophet Samuel and been rejected, and whatever it was, even if he's not clear if it's the kingdom, he knows his little brother got it instead. And it's clear something's been going on this entire time. In verse 29, and David said, "What have I now done?" It's just like, what now? What's the latest thing you're going after me for? You get like a very Joseph vibe from this too. Like this is very much like a Joseph and his older brother sort of thing. Is there not a cause? The KJV translates it. ESV and others just have it more like, what I'm saying stuff. Is it just you have a problem with me saying, these words? Is that it? Is there a problem with what I've said? But notice too in verse 28, just how, well, let's just put it down for what it is. The jealousy. Let's put that on the board. Like, sorry, dude. I wish my moments weren't recorded in scripture, and I'm glad they're not, but this one is something for us to learn from. When he talks to David, first of all, he's casting suspicions on what David's doing in general, right? Like, why are you even here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Just this little bit of sheep, those nothing amount of a nothing thing that you do with your life, that you have your task. Takes it further to accusation. I know you. Where God has just told us a chapter before, God knows him, right? Eliab says, no, I know you. You're prideful. Just completely wrong on it, every indication you can get. And the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And I was listening to one preacher talking about it, and he said that if it were him in the Bible, and as sarcastic as he can be, he would have said, what battle? Like that would have been the next verse. That would have been David's response instead. Like there's nothing happening here. There's nothing to see. There's nothing going on. But in one verse, we kind of get the payoff to what we saw last week with why this guy specifically was rejected by God. And if he had been chosen again, maybe the path he would have taken down, like maybe he would have gotten it together. Maybe he would have responded to God's spirit and blessing better than Saul did. But there's some deep issues going on with this guy here and what he's doing. In verse 30. So David's like, what is the deal? Is there a problem with what I'm saying? And he just ignores him. He just turns around to the next person. It's like, here's your cheese and sandwiches. Enjoy them. Goes on to the next person. And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. So he just repeats what he already said. And the people answered him again after the former manner. So I like how that guy I was listening to also pointed out that David's asking two questions this entire time. Like, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? And what's going to happen to the person who takes him out? The only one they're answering is what happens to the person who takes him out. Like they've ignored the spiritual question entirely here about who this guy is defying Israel. It's like, nope, they're just focused on, well, you get all this cool stuff if you do this. And so it just goes back to where their minds are at. But David, because he does have a heart after God, has chosen the truth. And when it comes to taking on obstacles, or in this case, very specifically, taking on Goliath, he adopts that perspective. That's his filter. Whatever God's already said about this thing, whatever God's done before, is the filter I'm going to choose to look at all the rest of this through. And so David then becomes the only one out of anybody on either side that can see what's really happening, that can see the situation for what it really is. There's one person out of thousands that gets the deal about what's going on. And verse 31, and when the words were heard, which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. So think about just how little is happening, that this is already going out enough to get back to the king this quickly. It's like, you hear this guy? He's rocking the boat over here. He's asking some questions, and he seems pretty defiant right now. We should tell Saul about this. This guy's got some energy. So think about how quiet it is and just how absolutely little there is happening, that this already gets back as noise in the camp. And he sent for him, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So this is also something that's kind of interesting that hadn't really jumped out to me before about Goliath, just the way I was thinking about it. I think Goliath's a known deal. Like, it's one thing to take him on one-on-one, but Saul says here that this guy's been a man of war from his youth, and I'm sure that's an assumption, but he's also a champion of the Philistines who've been fighting with Israel this entire time. Like, there's no way they haven't run into this dude somewhere before. And again, it becomes different when you're fighting one-on-one and you're expected to take him on by yourself. But I kind of think he's a known quantity at this point. Just no one wants to fight him one-on-one. Verse 34, and David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. So as far as David's concerned, Goliath already is a dead man walking. He's like this guy that has everybody in their tents, that everybody's scared to death of. He's already a walking corpse. Like, this guy's already done. This is guaranteed going to happen. And David does something else that we can do when we're up against either physical obstacles or spiritual obstacles, which is adopting the perspective of the truth, but also remembering what God has done in the past. So David rehearses all these things that are pretty impressive by any standard of just, a lion and a bear come up, I'm done for the day. I call it a loss. I ride off my sheep. I'm like, sorry, I lost them. I'm not fighting them. I'm not going after them. David's like, yeah, this happened, and so I went and I killed him. I took him out.
He even chased him down. I mean,
Chased
had him
him
in the
down.
mouth, so I was like, I'm just out. That's gone. He's out of here.
Yeah.
He's too far away, Dad.
Exactly. It's like, whoops, stop running so fast, lion. Exactly. That's what would happen. So he's caught up to all of them, and he's killed them, and he's given the credit for this to God. Again, showing that he is a man after God's own heart. But he's remembering the past even through this filter of the truth. So Saul's like, yeah, you're kind of a runt of a guy. It's like, I know you, I've been around you by this point. You're too young for this dude. And David's like, nah, I'm not really the one doing the fighting here, but someone else is using me to fight. So David's got a very interesting mix of humble and confident, completely confident happening in this moment, which is really like, kind of how obedience is supposed to look, I think. So, verse 37. David said, moreover, the Lord has delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with you. I'm pretty easily convinced, pretty quickly. It's like, all right. Why not? What else have we got at this point?
You look good to me.
Yep, exactly. So Saul's like, go, and the Lord be with you. Politician catchphrase that politicians are very good at throwing out. Go, and God be with you. Sure. Verse 38. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put on an helmet of brass upon his head, and he also armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off of him. So everybody always makes this out to be the, like the little 12-year-old trying them on. As Mr. West pointed out before, it's just he just hadn't fought in these things before. He wasn't used to this. It's not this little kid like trying to swim out of this armor, that he's in. It's
probably a little big for him, but still.
Probably a little big, yeah, because Saul's a big guy. But yeah.
Yeah, it's not crazy.
Yeah, it's not crazy huge. Just something he wasn't used to using. And so David put them off them, and he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So he goes and he finds 5 solid rocks, like we sang about before. He goes and finds 5 rocks, and he sticks to what he knows. So David's already seeing things as they are, right? He's seeing things from the perspective of the truth. But he's also sticking to what he knows. It's no outrageous solution, There's no Rocky montage where David goes and trains in the hills, right, and screams Goliath at the top of the mountain and all that stuff, then comes back and fights him. He sticks with what he knows. He goes with what he's got, what he's comfortable with. And that's how, in the end, we face obstacles. We do learn. We do grow through them. But quite often, we just stick to what we know. We'll be all right. More simply than looking for dramatic, huge solutions here like Saul was doing. We'll take all my armor, take all this stuff, and do this thing. And he drew near to the Philistine, verse 41. The Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. So what's the same thing that Saul, Goliath, and Eliab all have in this story? David. Yeah. They're all discounting David. And they're all using the exact same words to do it the whole time.
I'm mostly looking at the outside.
They're just
Yep.
What do they look at them?
Mm-hmm.
Short, young,
Yeah.
whatever.
Short, young, yeah. Uh-huh. I think ruddy. I think like Goliath even he's like, you're very red. Goliath points that
Fair
out.
countenance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Verse.
According to,
Yeah,
the,
exactly.
according to the flannel graphs I grew up with, those three men also had beards in common, whereas David was clean shaven. So maybe there's
That's
a
true.
beard thing.
This is true. Maybe it was a beard thing.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a beard thing. If he wasn't yet a man enough to have a beard, then how could he fight? Verse 43. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with stave? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. So Goliath's pretty insulted by this. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. And said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with the sword and with the spear and with the shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. So, again, let's pick something here in the confidence column for David. Goliath, the Philistines have their confidence. David has his, again, in the truth. It's not how great he's been, how great his accomplishments have been, all the things that he's been able to do in the past. But in facing this obstacle and this challenge, he first honors God in what he does. So Goliath's making fun of him for who he is, and David, again, being the only one who sees what's really happening right here, says, yeah, by the way, there's a whole another thing you have to deal with instead of just me. In the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, reminding him this is the one you've defied, and not just Israel. And hopefully Israel is hearing that at the same time. Verse 46. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. I like this back and forth. It's David literally repeating to Goliath. It's like, fine, I'm going to do that instead. So he's just throwing the same threat back at him. One says he'll feed him to the birds. The other one says, I'll feed you to the birds. And here we go, verse 47. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So again, bringing all the attention, all the focus back on God. Just consistently throughout this entire chapter, living out this idea of being a man after God's own heart. And this is what we've seen with Saul, right, over these past few weeks. Is Saul, let's put this up here. Saul can never get out of his own way. We saw an early victory where he credits the results to God. When God's Spirit's on him, when he's doing what he's supposed to do. But the rest of the time, it's just like he just can't get out of his own way. His own fears about himself, his own concerns about himself, his own pride. Like going and building monuments to his accomplishments and how great he was. But David, right off the bat, says it's going to be God that does this when this thing inevitably happens. And so, one more thing. David here. David saw his obstacle is already defeated. So the same thing with that idea of Goliath's just this walking corpse before. Putting it, just restating it a different way. When David comes out and faces Goliath again, he's already seeing this obstacle has defeated. which is a challenge, I think, for the things that face us. We know God's promises to us. We know God's assurances that he's given us. And we even know how God looks at things, like save, sanctify, glory, the whole deal. Like we know how God sees the picture. And so when these things come up that intimidate us or seem to be roadblocks to what we know God wants us to do, not just in general, but the things we know God wants us to do, I think David's a good example of seeing that obstacle as something already removed that God's going to take care of. All right, verse 48. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So it sinks in, it digs in, Goliath topples over. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword, so especially insulting, takes his own sword, this heavy sword, and draws it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. So this little, puny guy in their sight not only kills him, but then grabs Goliath's heavy sword and chops off Goliath's head with it. Very dramatic, very impressive. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So, confident, is gone.
Head is gone.
Head is gone. Make a little head this shoulder there. Gone. And history-minded comes up again very quick. Go as fast as you can. Get out of here. We lose again. Verse 52, and the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines. So now everyone's all fired up again. Like, giants out of the way, Goliath's dead, back to the war, cries. Until thou come to the valley, into the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sheremin, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. So they're going all the way back to Goliath's hometown here. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. David just carries this thing around. We'll see it again in a second. Yeah. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy son liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And this is where a lot of people seem to say, well, Saul wouldn't have asked who his father was, because he knew from chapter 16 who his father was. And I'm like, have you been around, not only just, have you been around a politician, much less anybody, for more than 30 seconds? It's like, no.
I mean, and the question really is he somebody? Is he somebody of importance? Is he somebody great? And he wasn't. Mm-hmm. He was a nobody from a little sheep town of Bethlehem. Yeah. So, yeah, it's no wonder he said that.
Yeah, exactly.
And no, he didn't talk to the harp player and say, so, give me your lineage. How you doing? Who's your dad?
Yeah. Tell me all those things about it. Yep. So people get all bent out of shape. They're like, oh, he sent to Jesse Corinth. It's like, look, man, just days are days and kings are kings and things are forgotten. Verse 57. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. So again, David's dragging this thing around with him. Yep. You can picture him chasing after the Philistines, dragging his head like in a bag or something the entire time, even spooking them with it as he goes, wherever he finds them. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, the young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. And dramatic pause, because that's the end of our story. And nothing ever happens between the two of them again, and it's all good. So, which is actually, we know from the next chapter, the moment when Jonathan's really struck by who this guy is and really impressed by David, and pretty much right then forms a friendship for the rest of his life with him because of what David's done here. So, we had 4 people coming in to this battlefield from all different walks of life, sharing some similarities with Goliath and Saul being rejected, having a lot of the similar characteristics. So 4 of them come in, 3 of them make it out, and Israel gets this great victory that glorifies and honors God, a victory that could have been Saul's if he had been doing what he should have been doing and obeying God. But instead, like we saw in Esther, God had to raise somebody else up to come in and deliver his people. and remind them who God really is. So a lot of lessons I think we can learn in facing our own obstacles and the challenges that come in front of us. Again, they always lie. There's always some kind of falsehood. They always look bigger than they really are in the end. Goliath's 9 feet tall, but God is infinite, right? But David was the only one out of all these people who realized that, who really let that sink in. And I'm sure other people would have told you that, they would have repeated it, but in this moment, when it came to actually standing before Goliath by themselves, it wasn't something they followed through with. And even Saul, after all he's faced, all that's happened to him, is paralyzed. Just paralyzed in this one. You kind of get the sense from the story that he is just sitting there not knowing what to do. Like Samuel's not talking to him, he has no fellowship with God at this point. And he's stuck. But David comes along, points all the attention back to God, and goes out and achieves this great victory against a literally huge obstacle in his case. And then Goliath's family continues to show up. More giants are fought. Apparently he had a lot of brothers and such, but including one of his brothers that almost kills David eventually. But stories for other days. So, any more thoughts on David and Goliath before we wrap it up?
I think that the David is a real taste of the hero or the savior that we all repeatedly, and the Bible repeatedly kind of looks for and longs for, and there's this pattern, this driving pattern of anticipation that ultimately culminates in Jesus, right, as the hero and the Messiah. But it's one of these I think great examples that fit into that pattern. I mean, your verse from Esther 4 is just another one where God can and does want to use you if you would have faith in him to be mighty to save. He can use anyone whose heart is humble and willing to be used, but there is failing, right? We are weak. We are disappointed time and again by our leaders, the people who we want to see lead, even our kings, our governments, and so on. But the Bible just paints this picture and this pattern of there is hope. There is a coming day when I will anoint, raise up, and use my king to win and to defeat the nonsense.
Yeah. And just like that Messiah, David was nothing like what they expected. Right? They all doubt in this. They all say even Samuel's like, well, looking at all David's older brothers who are more impressive. The same thing with Jesus when it comes along. It's like, oh, you're just a Nazarene. You're from this backwater, nowhere place. Friend of sinners and someone who drinks and eats. And how dare you? And yeah, very similar to David. And also, as we've seen from the past few weeks, very similar to Saul. Like Saul comes from a tribe that was nearly wiped out. Saul's got it seems like from the very first chapter you see, Saul's got this kind of social anxiety almost because of his background, his situation, and just himself. But David in his first story faces the exact same thing and throws all of it out the window, relying on God to do what he will with him. And the same thing for Jesus and all his doubters. Jesus constantly putting his faith in the Father, pointing always back to the Father, and it's the same thing that David does. So yeah, there's a lot of good parallels there.
Yeah, over time, I've really started to get the sense from the Gospels that Jesus is just straight up looking through everything all the time. He's really not caught up in what his eyes can see. His mind and his heart are always fixed on the Father. And that's exactly it. Like this pattern of failure is this pattern of getting caught up in what we see. That starts at the tree. That starts at that first temptation,
Yeah.
right? That it was good to look at and, good for food. But it's our stumbling block. It's like our kryptonite. It's our stupid eyeballs.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I like when David shows up. Yeah, he takes the giant, he takes the Philistines completely out of the equation. Like he sees them, but he doesn't see them.
He hears the words, and it's like, that's not right.
Yeah, he hears the words, and that's it. And he's like, nope, there's a bigger thing going on. And that is very much the example of Christ, and one that I think following would do us very well to do. Any other thoughts?
What's an Ephrathite? Who's Ephrath?
I don't know.
Who's Ephrath?
I don't know.
That's what Jesse is. What? I don't know
Well,
what
it's
that is.
Bethlehem of Bethesda, so that's that area.
It's the region.
It's the reason. There you go.
Bethlehem
Oh,
of
okay.
Bethesda. So
Okay.
that's what's mentioned in.
It's not a people group. It's a.
It may have been at some point, but that's the area after that.
Okay.
Cool.
So we look it up.
Yeah, and I don't have my phone on me. I can't do my little Googles off to the side.
We'll pause the live stream real quick. I'll come back with an answer. All right. Mr. Webb.